And the other thing that you sort of treat with caution, again, it's refreshing because you're questioning something that a lot of people are talking about at the moment, is the microbiome, um, and its role in mental health. And this is, I should say, in the first half of the book, these are just the ways in which the brain affects your mental health in the body. And you're cautious about the role of the gut. I know that there's lots and lots out there about how great it can be, how it's sometimes people feel like it's a real something that will solve their mental health problems if they eat if they take probiotics and eat fermented foods. But I was just fascinated to hear you say reliable studies so far, for a reason you could explain, aren't convincing you as a scientist.
Yes, I mean, not yet. I'll tell you that I would like the microbiome story to be true. It's really exciting. And I just, from a personal curiosity level, find it totally captivating. I'm really into it. And I've been following it for many years, sometimes more closely than others in relation to my own science. But the story is strongest in animal research, which differs in many, many ways from the human conditions of the microbiome. So what I believe from animal research is that under the right conditions, the microbiome can influence mental health-like behaviors. But those conditions are so stringent in animal studies. You control the environment, you often control the genes. And actually, in the kind of mess of humans, often the same predictions don't bear out. Now, perhaps there will be some kind of definitive studies in the coming years that will make the story a lot stronger. But because of how exciting it is, I think people have run with it a little bit before its time. And I'll give you an example. So one really interesting idea is that if you change the microbiome with an intervention like antibiotics, that might have knock-on effects on your mental health. This is one of the best ways of testing it because it's essentially a way of disrupting the microbiome and then you test it. So not just a correlation, which could be caused by differences in where you live, differences in your diet, so many other things. So you don't want to just show a difference in the microbiome between, say, people with better and worse mental health. You want to show a cause. So I like the studies in that respect. You can use antibiotics, you can disrupt the microbiome. But what has often been shown is that in people who've been on antibiotics a lot in development, this is a really big study that's been done on it, they have different microbiomes and kind of worse anxiety-like behaviors than people who haven't been on antibiotics a lot in childhood. And unfortunately, that doesn't provide any more certainty because it's a very sort of special population of people who have to be prescribed antibiotics frequently in development. They're not really matched with people who haven't been. And so in human studies, there are always these little variables that just haven't quite been accounted for and might be, maybe giving a lot of the power to the microbiome when actually it's driven by other things, at least, to some degree.
So you feel like it's something to watch and be hopeful about. And certainly if you like eating those sorts of foods and they work for you, do it, but it's not a magic bullet. Prove it.
Yes, I think it's not a magic bullet. And I also think we don't quite understand how it works. So even if the animal studies are right, my curiosity is right, and things like that, actually what we would need to understand is what bits of the microbiome, when would you need to intervene, what would you need to do, all of these big questions that have not yet been answered.
It's interesting because you talk about the experiments being done on rodents and not humans, but I felt that a great many of the experiments that you described, they are all done on rats and mice. Does that make a lot still up for discussion?
Yes, I think animal research can be incredibly informative and can be fundamental to our understanding of conditions and how to treat them. But we always need to kind of couch that with caution so that we can discover something with animals and then wait for converging research from humans. There are things that we can test and explore in animals that we cannot in humans. And that's, really rich scientific possibility. But we also need to know what's going on in humans in order to make any kind of inference about human behavior, mental health, and so on.
I think people listening and watching now, listening later, will probably be thinking what I think as you read your book, which is just a question more. What comes out, as a big headline in the newspaper or as a program, it's grabbed on by the media, and you do talk about that in the book, and it's why the book is so useful, because it's a much more nuanced and balanced approach, but the balance really stretches all the way through to that. And also people might be thinking, okay, well, what foods should I eat then? And rest assured, I will come to that part in a moment, but I just want to move, as you do, into your second part, which is about the ways in which you can enhance mental health via the brain. And there are so many, and the time will go too quickly, but people can read the book to find more. But you talk about the power of placebos, which I just found absolutely astounding. Again, one of the wows in the book was next to an experiment that you describe, in which something as concrete as surgery could be subject to the placebo effect. Knee surgery, you described, that improved a tear in people's knees just as much as actual surgery. So I wonder if you could describe to us how they work, and again, how they can help, because obviously not every individual people. How do placebos fit into the way in which we can enhance mental health?
Yeah, placebos get a really bad reputation, don't they? You want to take a medication that's better than placebo. Of course you do. That's the point of any clinical trial, is to show that a treatment is better than placebo. And it can be incredibly challenging, a topic I get into a little bit later in the book when I talk about psychedelics, but also psychological therapy, both of which are very challenging when it comes to finding a good placebo. But actually, from your individual perspective, when you take a medication or do a session of psychological therapy or any other intervention, you don't really mind how you get better as long as you get better. People like me mind, scientists mind, but from an individual perspective, you don't have to know what the route is. And so I think for that reason, actually knowing about placebos and just how powerful they are can be really informative for your own kind of personal experience of getting better or not after an intervention. It might maybe give you some doubt if something's worked for you, but you're not really sure how, or you've read maybe it's not quite so robust, but how could it work for me? Well, placebo is the answer. It might also maybe make you think twice about side effects that you've experienced, because I talk a little bit about the kind of inverse of the placebo effect called the nocebo effect. In both cases, placebo and nocebo, this is an example of where your expectations, often very deep knowledge about the world that you're not thinking about consciously, affect the outcomes of a treatment. So, for example, expectations that taking a drug will make you feel better. You've learned that your whole life. You believe it very strongly. And I don't mean actively believe, like think about it all the time. I mean, it's just something you know about the world. Often you take medication and then you get better. As a result, every time you take a medication, your own personal effect of that medication is boosted by that placebo effect. So that's how I think of placebos, as being a boost for treatments that we use. It's a challenge for scientists, but it's a good thing for patients.
It's a boost in certain scenarios. I mean, you describe homeopathy. That's where you say that it's purely placebo. And even people who don't even believe in homeopathy somehow have this innate belief in it that they don't know they have, and that's how it works. But what about something like antidepressants? I mean, there's been a lot of misinformation that you describe about how antidepressants work, or there's been a lot of sort of confusion and the idea that it's purely regarding serotonin. Now, I don't think that's quite the truth, or quite to be the case. But are antidepressants a mixture of what you're talking about, a placebo and something else, and that's how they work? Do you recommend them for patients suffering?
Antidepressants are a mixture of active ingredients and placebos, because all medications are. So antidepressants absolutely benefit from the placebo effect, but the antidepressants that we use today have come out as better than placebo in many, many, many robust trials. So I do think that the evidence suggests that they, of course, come with a big placebo effect, but they also have an effect on top of that that can be very helpful for some people's mental health. And I say some people's mental health because I think this is where some of the challenges about antidepressants originate. I think they originate in the idea that everyone's depression, say, comes from the same biological problem, which a couple decades ago was described as a difference in serotonin processing, a particular chemical in the brain that many antidepressants target. Now, for over a decade, we've known that's not necessarily the case. There are disruptions in serotonin processing in some people with depression, but they're complicated. It's often not enough, doesn't explain everyone's, and it's also, probably not the single thing that is responsible for the effect of antidepressants. The idea that they are correcting a deficit is a much too simplistic explanation, and isn't one that is used in kind of neuroscience textbooks today. Instead, there are a few different explanations, and I really put forward one that I think solves a lot of the problems with our understanding of antidepressants, which is the idea that antidepressants shift your cognitive bias. And this is true in everyone. So if you were to take a single dose of antidepressants, you would go from interpreting a negative or even neutral piece of information, say a sentence or a face that looks mildly neutral, mildly negative, as a bit more positive. So it shifts this kind of very low level information, even perceptual processing that we're doing. And over time, these shifts in perception add up to becoming a much grander change in your beliefs about the world, in your mood. And that's why antidepressants take a few weeks to work.
I mean, when you say that, you can't help thinking, well, in this very world of opinion and bias, antidepressants should be, could change something like that, sort of almost like the binary views that everybody has. The way you describe antidepressants is something to think of in that context.
Yeah, I hope so. So this theory of antidepressants, which was created kind of by a few different labs, but in particular, I talk about a professor at Oxford called Catherine Harmer, who's been who's played a major role in the discovery of these actions of antidepressants. And what she and many of us believe about the evidence here is that it moves us beyond antidepressants are an entirely biological phenomenon operating on some biological problem in depression, versus depression is some psychological phenomenon that could never be treated with something as, tiny and biological as a serotonin modifier, towards a kind of unified theory that addresses both the psychological component of depression with the pharmacological, biological actions of an antidepressant. And that's what I think is so useful. This is not a theory in one camp or the other. It's an explanation of how a biological agent has effects on the very cognitive processes that are essential to maintaining our emotional and mental well-being.